Have you ever asked yourself why character like Nilo is enough to give second life to bad reactions like Bloom, but characters like Chevreuse cannot do the same for Overload? Well, the easy answer is that their support is weaker, but it's not just that simple. To understand exactly why this is happening, we need to first understand these reactions on deeper level, and that's what we're gonna be doing today. We'll talk about their scaling, elements that are tied to supports they have, and most importantly, their problems. So let's start with simple, Bloom reaction. In case you forgot, it happens when you combine Dendro and Hydra. It spawns this cute thing that explodes after a while and deals Dendro damage to enemies around. Damage is actually not that bad, and level 90 character will deal almost 6000 baseline. In theory, you can use this as additional source of damage instead of building your team around it, but no one really does it. Why? The answer is simple, because there are better reactions to do. For Hydra, it's mostly Vaporize. Sometimes Hydra characters vaporize themselves and sometimes they enable it for someone else. Both scenarios generally result in higher damage than Bloom. Dendro, on the other hand, has Spread, which may seem like it deals less damage at first, after all baseline is not even 2000. But unlike other reactions, Spread provides additive base damage, which is affected by crit and bonus damage sources. So with all of that, it ends up doing more damage as well. And that's not even talking about Hyper Bloom and Bargain that just plainly deal twice more damage. So one problem is clear, it's lack of damage, and something needs to be done about that. Another problem, Bloom is delayed damage. Normally it exists for up to 6 seconds before finally exploding and dealing damage. Though if you are able to spawn a lot of them, it will go off after you spawn 5 other cores. But anyway, it takes a while to deal any damage. In big group of enemies that follow you around, it may not be that big of a deal. But if you are fighting single enemy with a lot of movement, like for example Mago Kenki, it will result in massive damage loss. And last problem is very minor, Bloom deals damage to yourself. In most cases though, it doesn't lead to massive changes, it just requires you to play a healer in your team. And that's the main problem Bloom has. So now let's take a look at what Nilo does. Her first passive transforms Dendro cores to bountiful cores that can be used for Hyper Bloom or Bargain, but explode significantly faster, just in 0.4 seconds. And just like that, one of the problems is fixed. Second passive increases Bloom damage by up to 400%, though it doesn't mean the damage will become 5 times higher, since it works additively with Elemental Mastery. So with high EM build, that will almost double the damage from your Bloom, and if you remember, that was exactly the difference to Hyper Bloom and Bargain. Unfortunately, Nilo doesn't do anything about self-damage, but rather makes situation even worse by increasing it. But because Genshin has decent choices of Hydra and Dendro healers, it usually doesn't matter that much. So as you can see, Nilo exactly pinpoints Bloom's problems and fixes them just enough to make it as good as other reactions. And it's important that it fixed all major ones. If it still dealt the same damage, it won't be worth it. And if it still took 6 seconds to go off, well, it may have been still playable, but very funky and not preferred by many players. So when you look at this, it becomes clear why and how Nilo was able to save Bloom. Now let's take a look at Overload. This reaction happens when you combine Electro and Pyro. It deals Pyro damage in small AoE and also knocks back enemies. Many people don't know that, but Overload's damage is not that bad. In fact, it's exactly the same as normal Bloom, almost 6000 and level 90. But you know the drill. Pyro can do Vaporize, Melt or even Bargain instead of it, that almost always results in more damage. Electro has Aggravate, which has just barely lower damage than Spread and can also play Hyper Bloom. So Overload loses about twice to competing transformative reactions and doesn't provide enough to challenge multiplicative. First problem is the same, simply lack of damage. Another one is probably even more severe, knockback. Initially it was designed to help you offer some sort of protection in form of controlling enemies. And sometimes it actually may help, for example in defending the monolith. But in most cases it ends up losing a lot of time due to displacing the enemies, which in Abyss is insanely bad. Some DPSs that can naturally mitigate that actually already had Overload teams, like for example Yoimiya. And that's about all major problems for Overload. Now let's take a look at Chevreuse kit. She is pretty straightforward, as all she does for Overload is reducing enemies' Electro and Pyro resistance by 40%. As a bonus, she also offers attack buff and some heal in case your team needs it, but that doesn't affect Overload directly. Resistance in Genshin works a bit wonky, but 40% reduction leads to about 37% damage increase on most enemies. It's not nearly as big as Bloom buff from Nilo, but still pretty good buff. But there is one problem with that. You see, both Nilo Nilo and Chevreuse restrict your team's elements for their passives to work to Hydro and Dendro and Pyre with Electro respectively. For Nilo, it doesn't result in many problems since Bloom is Dendro damage and only set that can directly support it is Depot Memories that works great on Dendro characters. Truth be told, even if you had to play it on Hydro characters, nothing really would change because it would still work. But Overload is Pyro damage and set that shreds Pyro resistance is when Death and Vener that requires Wearer to swirl. So Chevreuse passive has natural anti-synergy BVV and completely removes possibility of playing them together. In fact, Chevreuse offers exactly the same buff as VV with just a lot easier activation. This means she didn't really increase Overload damage at all and at best would increase the damage of your electric characters. And knockback was not addressed at all. Yes, her ult does have a minor grouping, but if that's all you need, Kazuha instead of her would do a better job. So as I said, Chevreuse didn't really bring any changes besides making some people play around with Overload which they wouldn't even try before. That being said, I'm in no way saying that Overload is unplayable, after all it's not Shatter. While it's not anywhere as good as best reactions Vivo without Chevreuse, it is still good enough to output decent damage. Especially so because Pyre and Electro elements have very good DPSs to offer. If anything, you can think of Chevreuse as replacement for Kazuha with some additional restrictions rather than support for Overload. Honestly, I hope they release more supports for forgotten reactions rather than just making them a tool for characters like Navia, Emily or Kinich. I guess we'll just have to wait and pray that Hoyo decides to not end the toll on Nilou. And that's all I have for you for today. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like and consider subscribing, it really helps me out a lot. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.